Thanks for coming to, we're midway through our 30th Naturalist Journeys Winter Presentations Series. Thanks for being a part of it. Raise your hand if you've been coming right all along since our first one. Great, well, welcome back. Well, I mean, maybe the first one of this year, how about? Yeah. How about the past 30 years, though? All right, great. All right, well, you can give the next presentation then. So there's tea in the kitchen. Please help yourself to it. Feel free to get up during the presentation and go help yourself to tea if you'd like. Restrooms are around the corner in the main room. Another one through the kitchen to the right. So every winter, Naturalist Journeys is where we come together and learn from ecologists and scientists and authors and explorers and everything in between. This year is all around river resilience is kind of our theme. And so over the last few weeks, we've been hearing about things kind of focusing at watershed scales, forest hydrology, understanding how water flows from headwaters to stream, talking about watersheds and what a watershed is. Coming up later on in the series, we are going to be hearing next week from Kasia Renzio and Aaron DeVries with Vermont River Conservancy around how to prioritize which miles of river within Vermont rise to the top for conservation priority and how you even go about deciding that. And then in March, we have our own teacher naturalist, Ana Maria Arroyo, who's going to be talking all about the riverside wildlife of the North Branch of the Winooski River using trail camera videos and photo compilations to really get to know the lives of these creatures. And then at the end of March, we have a chamber music performance by Vermont composers writing on themes of watershed and place, which will be really interesting at the end of March. So I want to thank our sponsors for making Naturalist Journeys possible. This year, Hunger Mountain Co-op, Waite Heindel Environmental, Catamount Solar, Onion River Outdoors, and Washington Electric Company. And special thanks to Lake Champlain Basin Program for making our whole River Resilience series possible. So let's just get a quick round of applause for our sponsors. Thank you. Those of you that are watching on the live stream, welcome. I will be keeping an eye on the live stream on my laptop, so if you have any questions that you want to put in the chat on YouTube, feel free to do that, and I can try to ask those of Shane as we go. No promises, but that's my goal at least. And this will be, it's being live streamed, but it's also being recorded. The recording will go on our website where all of our presentations do, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations. I'm sure you're all going to have lots and lots of questions throughout the evening. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. There'll also be some Q&A kind of at points throughout. So if you have questions, just hold them, and there'll be plenty of time where you shall be invited to ask those questions. So come up with some good ones. When we were putting together this series, and by that I mean our entire river resilience series back in last August, July, we were thinking, what's the issue that Front Porch Forum seems to have the most to say about? And dredging is probably by far and away the one. And more than that, just like how we have altered our channels and streams in Vermont recently and also over the last 300 years. And so there's really no one else better in the state, somebody who's worked with the DEC Rivers program for 16 years as a river scientist and then is now the Watershed Restoration Program Manager for the Vermont Nature Conservancy and has been for forever. There's really no one better to walk us through, to wade through the topic of dredging and river alterations with us tonight than Shane Jaquith. So please help me welcome Shane.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to start by taking issue with that last statement. There are a lot of great people. I appreciate it. That's a very flattering statement, and maybe I'm a pretty good person to stand up here and talk about this. But there are lots of others. We have a couple in the audience. George Springston, former geology professor at Norwich, and worked with the state geology program on and off. Worked with the Rivers program when I was there, and Mike Klein, who headed the Rivers program when I was there, and really led a lot of the state's foray into coming to understand the science that really underpins this current state policy around river management. So, Sean, I appreciate it. That was nice. But there are definitely a lot of great people in this state that could talk around this issue. And one is a fellow named Roy Schiff with SLR Consulting. And Roy and I did a similar presentation about dredging in Hardwick this past September. And it was just yesterday. I was like, why didn't I recommend to Sean that we have Roy there too? Because Roy gives from an engineering perspective, gives a really good talk on this topic. And I don't know why I didn't think about that, Sean, but today I gave Roy a quick email last minute and said, hey, Roy, can I borrow some of your slides that you gave? So I've got some of Roy's slides in this mix too. And then while I was at it, I thought, well, geez, maybe I should email my old colleagues at DEC and get some information from the Rivers program too. And so they contributed some slides to this presentation. So this is kind of a team effort. And on that line, Sam's here from Friends of the Winooski River. They're out there doing great work. Friends of the Mad River are doing great work in the watershed. Michelle is here with the Friends. The Conservation District's doing great work. So really, there are a lot of people and organizations involved in this realm of work. So I just want to acknowledge all those folks because so much of what I know and understand comes from collaboration with a lot of great minds. So with that, we are here to talk about whether to dredge or not to dredge. Sean and I had a little conversation about this title, and I kind of was trying to push away from focusing right on the dredging issue, but hey, controversy sells, so we went with it, and here we are. I would have and here we go, I get to do this. I wanted to broaden the scope out a little bit and really think about the broader scope of our exposure to flood hazards and how we mitigate those flood hazards and really what we've learned from our experience to mitigate or reduce our exposure to flood hazards. So I'm going to start. It's going to be a winding journey, but that's going to kind of be the overall goal, is to think about what we've learned from our experience. And then we'll get right to the dredging. So our experience, Vermont has a long history of large flood events going back to 1869. We can see what do we have, 6 up there, compiled by NOAA. And you can see how much, those dollars all adjusted for 2012 dollars. So millions and millions, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. I guess we get into the billions pretty quick there. So a long history of very large flood events that have been devastating to the state. That I think, I did the math on this the other day and I forgot to remind myself of what that was. I think we're every 24 to 30 years or so, if you average the time span between each of these flood events, so every 24, 30 years or something like that. Then, in between those really large flood events, we have these smaller regional little floods that happen here or there. And one thing about this that I became aware of when I worked for the Rivers program and would hear about all of these different floods because we were responding to these floods is that, gosh, there are lots of little floods that happen throughout the state that people up in the Northwest have no idea that there's floods going on down in the Southeast or the central Vermont. And as a community, Vermont, as a state community, we don't really recognize how much we're impacted by flood events. Now, this was around mid-2000s, the mid-aughts, somewhere around there. Of course, that's different now. We all seem to understand our vulnerability to floods. Anyway, the point here is that we have lots of smaller floods that happen at a much more frequent time periodicity. Between 73 and 2011, 19 disastrous floods of a regional scale every 1 to 2 years. Okay, so really big statewide floods, hundreds of millions of dollars every 24, 34 years, and then in between those, lots of smaller floods. So we're constantly experiencing flood events. This slide's popping up a little bit earlier than I thought it was. So just let's talk a little bit about flood damage, because we talk about flood damage a lot, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. We have inundation damage and we have erosion damage, right? Inundation damage is what Montpelier really mostly experienced in 23, right, as shown by the image there. The water comes up, it overtops the banks, it gets in our basements, it gets on tops of our roads, it fills our cellars with muck, all of that, right? Inundation damage. Then there's erosion damage, right? Erosion damage is just that, damage caused by erosion. Our roads, washing into the rivers, our houses falling into the rivers as the banks melt under the force of the flowing water, right? 75%, as it turns out, 75% of all of our flood damage costs in Vermont result from erosion damage. And that's really important, because as we think about how we're going to mitigate our vulnerabilities, we really have to understand what our vulnerabilities are, right? Inundation and erosion, two very different things, and the way you deal with them, probably very different.
2 summers ago in Peacham, I spent a couple of days in the muck with a shovel.
Yes.
That's inundation. Is that counted in your statistic? Because inundation, a lot of us have mucked out Montpelier and other towns. Is that a cost that's counted? We can't do the roads. We need machines and professionals for that, the erosion stuff. But we can do the inundation ourselves.
Yeah. I believe that those costs are tallied, and those are all do feed into the disaster declaration reports, that go up to FEMA. So
we can't count the hundreds of hours of people in downtown Montpelier.
I don't know the way the municipalities tally that. These figures come from the state flood hazard mitigation report, or plan rather. I believe the towns and the municipalities feed up information. The extent to which they get information from individuals who are working on their own, I'm not totally positive on that. But just think about, that image on the lower right and how much it costs to rebuild Route 4 and how many miles of road, right? So that's, you start to get a sense of, okay, this is the expensive stuff, right? Not that mucking out basements and all that damage isn't devastating. It's not mentally devastating, financially devastating to individuals and businesses. But if you really step back and tally up all the costs, it's the erosion damage that's driving that. Okay, so let's talk about our risks, a few of our risk factors. First is topography, right? We're a mountainous state, very narrow valleys, and we often have to build infrastructure in the bottoms of those narrow valleys right next to our rivers. Many of our roads actually are on old riverbeds that have been filled. So our topography, right? Fast, steep, fast-running, powerful streams running down our steep mountainsides, hitting our valley bottoms. That's just a LiDAR image. It just shows relief. I think these relief images are really powerful because we can really see that this landscape was really formed by the river and moving back and forth, right? And here is Brook Road running down in that valley bottom that was made flat by that river moving back and forth. So all of a sudden we have a sense of, oh wow, is that road really in a good spot there? How quickly does that river actually move back and forth across that valley? Huh. And just another one, right? I think that's maybe Montgomery. Yeah, that's 118 up in Montgomery. So another risk factor, riverside development. So again, I'm using this hillshade. Look, you can see this escarpment here, carved by the river. You can see little old channels there. You can see this escarpment here where that river flowed there. So that river's really been back and forth, right? It's really kind of easy to see that, right? When we look at that relief map, and look, we've got little old channel scrolls here. So the river's been moving around there. I don't really know. George probably has a better handle on that. Over what time period? Tens of thousands of years? I don't know. Thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. How long is it? Well, since last glaciation, that was about, what, 13,000 years ago? So, we're in that time period. That's my hometown of Huntington. And that's a section of river that's been channelized, and that was all ag field. And then in the 80s, those developments went in, and Every day I drive by that river, I'm watching it slowly unravel. And sooner or later, it's going to really go, and we're going to have a lot to deal with in the town of Huntington. And, that's kind of the result we get, right? All right, climate. I think we all know this story. I don't have to dwell on this, right? Climate is changing. The amount of precipitation that we get in the form of intense events is increased between 58 to 2011. We are receiving more, 74% more precipitation, intense precipitation events. We've got a couple studies, I'm sure there's lots of studies, I grabbed a couple. This one by Dartmouth College talking about the increase in extreme precipitation. And then this one done at Gund Institute at UVM talking about the fact that flooding in Vermont, flood damages are calculated to exceed 5.2 billion over the next 100 years. So it's only going to get worse, right? We all know that. So historically, we have worked to mitigate our flood hazards. It's really been a command and control approach, right? European settlers arrived. We straightened the rivers to get them out of the way of agriculture and developments, transportation networks. We dredged them to keep the water in the channel to prevent that inundation damage, right? We were really focused on inundation damage initially, right? You arrive on the continent and you see rivers come up and flood your field or your road, and so you dredge the channel deeper, keep the water in the channel. And then we also armored the banks of those channels to keep them from moving back to where they were before we moved them. Or if we hadn't touched them, to keep them from moving, somewhere else where we had already built. So it's really been a command and control approach. Slides are looking a little funny. This is what rivers look like. They meander, right? They meander. They wiggle down the valley. This is George Springston's work right here, actually. George did a little time-lapse series of the third branch of the White River and show how much it's moved over time, right? Rivers move. And they're not typically straight, and they don't turn and right, at sharp angles. But the White River in Lower Granville sure does. So this is conveniently along the toe of the valley wall on one side, and then it quickly makes its way across the valley bottom and gets out of the way really quickly and turns at a sharp angle as it heads downstream. That river was moved to make way for agriculture and the transportation network. In my hometown, the Huntington River runs pretty straight along the toe of the valley wall, conveniently out of the way of agriculture, and then it makes sharp turns where needed. And the Black Creek up in Fairfield. That's a rail bed just to the south of the river there. You can see where it runs straight, and you can see the oxbow's been cut off. If we drive the Winooski Valley and look out from I-89 on either side, we see the old meanders cut off. So we have moved and straightened, and you can find examples of this all over the state. A lot of the rivers we have altered. So I think I'm going to skip that one. Well, okay, yeah, I'll quickly do this one. So if we want to think about the impacts of things like dredging our rivers, making them deeper, and straightening them, we kind of have to start by understanding that there's a balance going on. And I'm going to just really simplify this. There's a balance between the power of the water and the amount of sediment that the river, that's delivered to the river, and the river actually has to move. There's a balance going on. And when we impact things like the slope or depth, we affect that balance. And so we get a tipping of the balance. And things swing either towards erosion of the channel or towards filling of the channel. So there's this balance. We refer to it as a dynamic equilibrium. There's an equilibrium at play in river systems, right? Lots of natural systems, and even engineered systems, there's an equilibrium at play. So that holds true in rivers. So when we dredge rivers to keep the water in the channel, we start with a river like this, and this is sort of, this is a hypothetical, of course, cartoon that I drew up. This channel, borders a road, and before anything's done, it has access to this really broad floodplain, so that when the water comes up, it can spread out across that broad floodplain. And that's super important because that equilibrium thing going on, one of the factors that affect the power of the flow is depth of the water. So when the river comes up, this channel is only so deep. The water just can't get that deep. And then it spills out into the floodplain. And it's really shallow out here. Energy dissipates, sediments drop out, the water slows down. Things are calm out there on the floodplain. And the depth of the flow in the channel is governed, right? It just can't get that deep. It can't get that powerful. So it's got a low bank. That water can get out onto the floodplain really easily because there's a low bank. So let's say that, we just get nervous and we're worried about the road getting flooded, so we decide to dredge the channel. So we go in there, we dredge it out. Now we've got a nice deep channel, and even when we get these big rain and snowmelt events, all that water now can fit in the channel. And maybe the farmers it's not a farmer, maybe it's a tree farmer, Christmas tree farmer, I guess. Maybe the Christmas tree farmer's happy over here. The road commissioner's happy because that water's not ever going to get near that road surface, right? And everything's good. But look how deep the water is. Look how deep the water is. So every cubic foot of water weighs 62 pounds. So when you stack up a foot of water on top of a foot of water on top of a foot of water, every time you do that, you're adding another 62 pounds to that bed that's got gravels and cobbles on it. And that flowing water, that's 62 pounds and 120, oh gosh, I can't even do the math on that one. And then another 62 pounds bearing down on that and scraping everything away. And we get bed erosion. And the toes of the banks give away, and we end up with that sort of, that major channel adjustment in the road or the house coming into the channel. So that's the problem with dredging. We take away the pressure relief valve, the natural pressure relief valve that the river has, and we just create much more energy in the channel. And that channel it's just an earthen channel, right? It just can't stand up to that much stress or force. This is just another graphic showing kind of the same thing. The scenario is the homeowner gets tired of getting flooded, so they try to fit all this water in the channel by making the channel bigger. You get all that stress on the toes of the banks because you get that really deep water, and the toe gives away and the house falls in the river. Go ahead, Michelle.
On your slide back, some of your Christmas trees are brown now.
What is the tree parasite of choice?
Is it the lowered water table?
Thank you. Yeah, I gave this talk to one group where the water table, it was a wetlands talk. And so the water table was important. I even forget that I even have it there. Obviously, I forget that I even have it. So one thing that happens when you dredge so the water table is supported by the riverbed. Right, the elevation of the water table is going to follow the elevation of the riverbed, right? Like everyone's like everyone else got this except for me. So, right, you dredge that and you lower the bed of the channel, and the water table follows it. And yeah, that's why I did I even put the brown trees there. I know, gosh, it's been a while since I've given this slide, I guess. Thanks, Michelle. What else is on there? Okay, so same thing. The thing I was playing with here is like, if we're gonna get into the details of the slides, I was playing with the idea that like we call this the floodplain. It's just the high flow channel, right? It's just the high flow channel, and this is the low flow channel. And we can't expect all the water of the high flow channel, and I'll show some slides from my engineering friend Roy gave me, so we know that's the truth because he's an engineer. So I trust him. We can't fit all the water in the high flow channel. We just can't make this big enough to fit all the water of the high flow channel into the low flow channel. We just can't, and expect that channel to hold up. It just doesn't. There's just too much force. There's too much weight of water. There's too much stress. There's too much velocity. All right. So I talked about dredging. I also talked about the fact that we straightened a lot of our rivers. What's the problem with straightening our rivers? Again, it gets back to this whole equilibrium thing. One of the factors of power that affects the power of the water is the slope of the river, right? Because the steeper the river is, the faster the water is going to go, the more stress it's going to generate on the bed and the banks of the river. So it has to do with that. So when we straighten a river, so we have a nice meandering river here. We have a hypothetical dredged or straightened channel here. So let's just pretend that for some reason we decided we wanted to straighten the river. That looks all fine from the air, not really any problem. But let's look at it from the side. Let's look at it from the slope perspective. So this is the long meandering channel getting from elevation A down to elevation B over this really long horizontal distance, and there's the slope. We straighten the channel, we take all the length out of it, and all of a sudden we have this really short, much shorter channel. In my hypothetical here, it's 2,000 feet long versus 3,600 feet long. And we're still dropping that same elevation, so of course it's steeper. Now the channel's steeper, it's got more velocity, it's got more power, and it just erodes the bed and the banks of the channel more readily. Does that make sense to everybody?
What is B move?
What is B?
Isn't B the same place, whether it's meandering or straightened?
It is, yes, B is the same location, but this is the length of the channel, not the length of the valley. Yeah, this is a good question. You stumped me that's a good question. So A to B, so B is still here, and A is still here. Or, actually, they're not even on the plot, probably. The channel length is shorter. If we were to stretch this out, it would, if we were to pull on this point and stretch out this meandering line, it would stretch out to here, right? That channel's that long. This channel is only this long, so it actually almost corresponds. I didn't do that intentionally, but it does almost correspond. I slide that slide over a little bit more. So does that make sense? The channel's a lot shorter, right? So this is the length of the channel, not that same valley length.
And the slope.
Is that?
The slope changes.
So the slope is what changes, right? Does that make sense? Like if you were to hike up the mountain and meander your way up, you'd take you a lot more distance, and you're still getting to the same point, but it's a lot more distance. And the slope of your walk's a lot less, and you're not breathing nearly as heavy and sweating nearly as much.
Could you just quickly explain the relationship between velocity and force? I think the answer is quadratic.
Velocity is what, two times the square. Force is 2 times the square of velocity, or something like that. It's not linear. I can tell you that. Yeah. So when you increase the velocity, you increase and is it stream power or it's not shear stress? I think it's stream power. This is my friend Roy Schiff, the engineer. He's the one that could answer this question. It's like 2 times the square or something like that.
From the live stream, kinetic
Yes.
energy equals 1/2 times mass times velocity squared.
Yeah, times velocity squared. There we go.
Anyway.
All right. So does everyone get that? When we dredge the rivers, the increased weight of the water bears down and does more erosion on the bed and the banks. And then when we straighten the rivers, it makes them steeper and they have more velocity. And 1 times the mass whatever he just said, more force, right? And you can talk about that in terms of stress, shearing stress, or power, actually watts. So what is force? Yeah, I don't know what units force is in, like power is in watts. Is power force? I don't know. We're getting into like physics, engineering, like, yeah, I'm not the engineer. Okay, so moving on. What else have we done? So this is all about disrupting this balance or this equilibrium. The other thing at play here on the other side is on the resistance side. I'm sorry, that's really small, but remember it's the power of the water versus the amount of gravel in the stream that water has to move, right? And they're kind of in balance and they swing back and forth a little bit. So on the gravel side, right, we remove a lot of gravel. Now the gravel's important because it counters the force of the water. The water actually has to pick up that gravel. Every time there's a significant flood event, all of our gravel bars are kind of migrating down the valley, right? One bar, a majority of the gravel's on one bar, move to the next bar, and that bar moves to the next bar. Everything's moving down the valley, okay? And the water has to move it, and that burns up a lot of energy, so that energy or force can't go to work on the actual bed of the stream and the banks of the stream and erode that channel out. It's just moving the gravel that's in there. So that gravel's important because it absorbs energy. River's always going to want to meander. People say, well, can't we just straighten the river and get rid of the gravel, right? Just keep it straight. There are little turbulence, like because the channel beds are rough, because they're gravel and cobble, they're not smooth. There's always going to be little turbulence, little eddies and turbulent structures that set up, and it's going to push that water back and forth. And the water starts to actually spiral in a helical sort of flow around a bend. That's why we get the cut bank on the outside. It scoops the bottom and it drags the gravel up, and that's why we get these point bars on the inside of our bends, inside of the meander bends. So the water always wants to flow in a meandering pattern, no matter how much we straighten it. A lot of this stuff, in the 70s and 80s, there were lots of flume studies done. They would polish the walls of the flume and put water down it and put dye in it and see if they could get the water just to go straight. And they kept polishing. They were like, the sidewalls are rough, and that's why we're getting this, bouncing back and forth. Let's polish it more and polish it more. And they would polish it with a finer and finer and finer grit, and they just couldn't polish it to the extent there's always some little turbulence that sets up, and that water starts, going back and forth and going that helical flow path, and just always wants to move that way. We look at the jet stream. Jet stream doesn't circulate the globe in a straight path. It meanders back and forth, right? If you look at flow through glaciers, it meanders back and forth. So the gravel's important. Removing gravel disrupts the balance, and rivers are always going to want to meander. It's just nature. It's physics. Okay, so this is what's known as a channel evolution model. It's a 5-stage model. And what it really just shows is what happens when we tip that balance in the favor of the power of the water over the resistance or the burden of the gravels, the sediments. So starting here where it's the channel's stable, it's a small channel, low banks, it has access to a broad floodplain. When it really rains and the snow melts and the river comes up, that water can spread out and utilize the whole floodplain or the large flow, the high flow channel, right? And the energy in the low flow channel, the energy in the channel is moderated because we've got this big pressure relief valve. Somebody builds a house, they get flooded a few times because that darn river's is using its high flow channel and moderating its energy and doing all that stuff that rivers do. And the house gets flooded, they get frustrated, they berm the river, separating the river from the floodplain. No more pressure relief valve. So the water now, instead of getting just that deep, now it can get that deep, and now that excess energy, again, just like the dredging implications, that excess weight of water in the channel now goes to work on the bed, it erodes the bed away, and the bed just starts down cutting, or what we like to talk, we often talk about as incising And just say it's gullying. It's just a gully. Sometimes scientists have to come up with terminology like incising. It's just a gully. It's a gully, right? It starts gullying. The gully gets so deep that eventually the banks cave in and they get, goes into this widening phase. The house falls in. And then so much gravel comes in and starts building bars. These are supposed to be big gravel bars. Think about the west branch of the Little River, if you've seen that. I don't know if there's anywhere on the north branch where you have a lot of sort of stage 4, lots of large gravel bars. But the west branch of the Little River is a great example. And these gravel bars grow and they push the river side to side, and the river's getting longer. So the energy in the river is getting lower because the slope's decreasing. And that gravel, instead of getting flushed downstream, these things start to grow taller and taller, with gravel, right? The bars build higher and the bars build higher and higher. They get to a point where they're not getting flooded so often that vegetation can actually take root. They start to vegetate, revegetate, they get stable, and eventually you get they turn into your new floodplain, essentially become new floodplain. And you've got a small channel with a broad floodplain, just like you did up above, and everything's good again, except you've lost all of that land mass, you've lost all of that infrastructure and other human investments. Does that make sense? Mike remembers when we first came across this and showed this to the gentleman that was our boss at the time, who had been permitting riprap on rivers that looked like this for about 15, 20 years at the time, maybe. And he said, he said, I've been putting riprap on this river right here that looks like this and wondering why it kept going down, because I wasn't letting it widen out and all. We were arresting the rivers. We were locking them into this morphology, and so they just wanted to keep cutting downward. So when you bring science and a new understanding to a problem, you can start to see the bigger picture and see things differently. And that's when our approach to managing our rivers across Vermont started to change. DEC, the Rivers Program, really under Mike's leadership, when Governor Douglas came into the office with his clean and clear ambitions and started pushing a bunch of money towards DEC Rivers Program, Mike developed protocols for conducting assessment of the physical condition of rivers. And we started paying consultants to go out there and assess all the rivers across the state. And what we found was that 75% in total were in stages 2, 3, or 4 of this channel evolution process. They were incised, they were separated from their pressure relief valve floodplains, their banks were caving in, and this is the condition that we're currently in. And when we get large flow events, this is probably maybe the biggest factor that contributes to the high degree of vulnerability that we have to erosion damages in Vermont. This current condition of our river systems. How am I doing for time? Oh, that big round thing in front of me. Okay, thanks. So what I just went through, and I kind of stumbled through it. I apologize for that. A few of those slides weren't where they were supposed to be. Threw me off a little bit. But what I hopefully just went through was developing Vermont's flood risk equation, really. So we've got steep topography. We've got really hazardous development risky development patterns, where our rivers are in the state of channel evolution. They're really unstable, disconnected from their floodplains. We have increasing precipitation, intense precipitation, thanks to climate change. And what we have and what we're going to see more of if we keep going the same way are, tumbling houses, roads, and bridges. So that's kind of where we are right now. And I just want to back up. Maybe I didn't go into it enough, but I started by saying it was a command and control approach that we've taken to our flood mitigation efforts. It really, I mean, I don't think I emphasize, I'm feeling like I should have had more pictures of big yellow machines hogging out rivers in those past slides, right? We have just worked to straighten our rivers and dredge, make the channels deeper, make them straighter, move them away from our structures, right? Move them, make them deeper, armor them, keep them where we want them. That's been our approach. And hopefully the explanation of dredging and straightening and the negative implications, that is all to say that's why that doesn't work. And this is where we are as a result of that approach, right? This is where we are. So that gets at the answer of like to dredge or not to dredge, in a sense. Okay, and my answer is not to dredge. This is Mike's slide. It's a great one though, because this is what we've gotten into. Right? We encroach on the river, and when we first did this, when we first came to the continent, we had no idea that rivers moved and that they flooded so frequently. We didn't know, so we built kind of close to them because it was the best place to build. So we encroached onto our rivers, right, into the floodplains. Then we get floods and property damage, and then we would dredge, berm, and armor and convince ourselves that, oh, now that we've dredged and bermed and armored the snot out of the river, the armoring and the dredging deeper to keep the waters in the channel, we can go back to encroaching again, because now we're safe, right? And we're in this cycle, and I think we're still in it. From a policy perspective, the state's trying to move us out of it, but we're not quite there yet. We're in this cycle where we encroach on the river, we get hit really hard with floods, our response is to dredge, berm, and armor, convince ourselves that we're safe and we can encroach further, so we encroach further. And it's been expensive. I don't know why the title slide popped up midway through the presentation. Oh, well, that was kind of the end of that section of the presentation. So that's the end of the section. I've been at it for I guess it's been 45 minutes. Questions now on that whole part of it? Yeah, okay.
You said your answer to the question is not to dredge. Are there situations where you think dredging is a good idea?
These slides are from Roy Schiff of SLR Consulting. They're an engineering firm out of Waterbury. They've worked with the state and its partners and municipalities and private individuals on flood hazard mitigation and projects for a long time, and they do really great work. So places that require sediment, and this is from their perspective. Undersized bridges near breaks and valley slope on alluvial fans, that's really complicated. Places where gravel tends to fall out and clog up our bridges. We need to keep our bridges clear. And until we replace all of our bridges with larger bridges, which we are on the path towards doing, but boy, that's going to take hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? How long? We're going to have to keep doing that. We're going to have to keep doing that. In the vicinities of homes and businesses, again, on alluvial fans, if you've ever seen pictures of rivers out west, that these creeks coming down the steep valley and then they hit the big valley bottom and you get the splay of sediments and gravels that's kind of like fan-shaped. We have those in Vermont. They were really active and not vegetated in the past. Most of them are pretty stable now, although there are quite a few that are pretty active still, but you don't see them like you do out west. They don't jump out at you in the same way, because a lot of them are vegetated. But in those situations, you need to manage the sediment because they're highly depositional environments. Gravel just drops out right there. And then, kind of the same, this third bullet, when bridges, culverts, dams, or levees are knocked out of design compliance due to sediment buildup. So those are kind of the situations. I asked DEC for their perspective, and they gave me this long list, but it's essentially the same. Installation or repair of foundation, like bridge abutments and piers, culverts, utility crossings, right? When you have to repair those things that are in the water, you're gonna have to do some gravel extraction likely. Protection of improved property, protection of housing, loss of capacity of hydraulic structures, that's just bridges and culverts that are getting clogged again, that same one. In urban historical maintained streams, post-flood concurrent with removal of debris blockages, so where we have debris blockages in urban settings, We're going to have to, we're going to have to manage that stuff. Here's one that came up, I think, in Barrie a lot. The stormwater outlets from the city were actually blocked up because of sediment deposited in the, is that the Stevens there in Barrie? Yeah, in the Stevens, the sediment. So they had to get rid of that gravel so to open up those outlets. So that's another place where they did it. Removal of wood, this is going to trigger some of us. There was a lot of wood removal that a lot of us thought was ill-advised. Sometimes it needs to be done, but sometimes it goes overboard. So if we need to remove wood to open up, again, bridges or culverts, sometimes you're removing gravel at the same time, right? If gravel is directing the flow path right at the road embankment, you get a large gravel bottom deposit and all of a sudden the flow is going right at the embankment and you're seeing scour, yeah, you got to do something about that, and removing that gravel bar is probably the best thing to do. So there are times when we need to do it. But the idea that, every channel in the state, every foot of every channel should be treated by a big yellow machine every other year, so that the water never gets on the field, and that channel ideally would be straight and armored. That's fading. That's we're moving away from that.
Related, can you talk about the relationship between dredging out the channel with the big yellow machine and the refill of sediment that happens in that afterwards?
Yeah.
I was going to ask the same question you're saying about head cutting.
Yeah, head cutting. I don't have a head cutting slide in here. So who's heard of this place called Niagara Falls? Does anybody realize that the only reason Niagara Falls is still where it is because every so often, every so often, the face of Niagara Falls, the rock cliffs that the water goes over, the falls, right? That rock, every so often, that face kind of collapses. And then they come in and they put it back up. Because they don't want Niagara Falls, because what happens if that keeps collapsing? The falls actually moves, right? It kind of moves in the upstream direction, right? And you've got, what do you have there? What do all those tourist traps that they have right there? You can't move the tourist traps too, so you gotta hold that's called head cutting. And that can happen on rivers with bedrock beds where the bedrock caves off, but even on rivers of gravel, sometimes you'll see this really steep face in the riverbed, and then a couple of years later, that steep drop in the riverbed has moved upstream 10 or 15 feet. You often see this upstream of culverts because they'll come in, they'll clean out the inlet of the culvert, and the river will be coming down, and all of a sudden it'll drop because they've dug out right upstream because they figure, the gravel's going to come down. We'll kind of make a sump, right? You kind of make a sump but when you do that gravel bed, it just can't stand up, and slowly, it collapses and it kind of moves in the upstream direction. So the insidious thing about that is you have that. I haven't talked about channel incision either. Well, I did. I did. That incision process that I showed in the channel evolution model, well, that doesn't happen and just stay there. Because of the head cutting process, it actually migrates upstream. So you might be standing on your property looking downstream at your neighbor's property and go, wow, you got a really incised channel there, sucks to be you. And 3 years later, you're like, oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute, that channel, that incision has migrated upstream. It's head cut up through my property. Now I've got an incised channel too. So when we dredge our rivers, we send these incision, these head cuts up through our channel network. We all think about problems in rivers migrating in the downstream direction, like pollution and migrating in the downstream. Well, this geomorphic problems, this channel incision, it migrates in the upstream direction. Does that answer? I don't know what the question was going to be. But
Follow the question over here, which is when we dredge, we set up a head cut, which just fills the hole we dug in within a couple storms.
Thank you.
So, it didn't really last in the first place.
Did everybody get that? Right? You dredge, you get this head cutting thing, all this gravel from the bed is falling into the channel, it's getting plucked by the water. That just washes downstream into the hole that you dug. So you dredge to create more more capacity for the water. Well, you're just creating erosion upstream that just fills in the hole, and we just keep repeating that cycle over and over again. Did that get at your question? Okay, thanks for the help, Mike. I told you there were lots of good people. And
I wonder if you would want to comment on the impact of dams in these scenarios.
so dams slow the water upstream. And they cause the water surface. So here's the water surface. You put the dam in. I'm going to try to do this like, right? And then the water surface goes like that, right? You back up the water. The water surface becomes flat. You've created a pond on the upstream side of the dam. Flat water has less energy than steeper flowing water. So that steep flowing water comes down the hillside. It hits your pond upstream of your dam, your impoundment, and all the gravel that it's carrying falls out and slowly fills up the reservoir, right? The dam impoundment, they all slowly filled up. Downstream of the dam, there's no gravel coming in the water. There's no burden, there's no load consuming the energy of the flow. Remember the power, the balance, the equilibrium between the power of the flow and the burden of moving the gravel. Well, now all of a sudden downstream of the dam, you have gravel-free water. What a lot of people refer to as hungry water. It's super erosive. It has a lot of energy because it doesn't have any gravel in it consuming energy. So the energy of that, and plus you have that really tall plunge, so you have all that hydraulic head or that large drop. So you've got energy from that, and then the water's got a lot more energy because it's not carrying any gravel, so it goes to work on the bed and the banks. Oftentimes, if you look downstream of dams, you see a long reach that's really eroded. It's deep, it's wider. The gravels or the materials in the bed are coarse, meaning they're bigger, because all of the smaller materials have been carried away because you've got that much more power. So you stand on a dam and you look downstream, it's like, wow, there's a lot of big material in the stream, but you walk upstream above the impoundment and you're into much smaller material. So dams kind of throw things off in that way. Lots of other implications of dams too, but if we're talking about erosion issues, that's where dams come in.
So you told the story about someone who had been permitting riprap along river banks for a number of years and realized that they've screwed up. Maybe not you, but if there's somebody else in the room who could talk maybe a bit more about how has the permitting, handing out of permits changed as the river thinking and more, naturalization of the rivers?
Yeah.
Corridors?
Yeah.
How that's changed?
So I'll start into it, and then the guy that wrote the rule can speak to the rest of it. But it goes back to this idea of equilibrium. So the state now has a standard that an application, a proposed project must meet. It must meet the equilibrium standard. And what that standard basically says is that you can't do anything in a river that's going to throw off this balance. Right? That's at its core, that's what it says. You have to meet the equilibrium standard. And that's used every time there's an application to do something in the river. The river management engineer, there's 5 river management engineers currently, and they're regionalized around the state. They look at that application, they look at the project plans, and they put that up against the question of, is this going to disturb the equilibrium of the river? Is this going to throw off the equilibrium? I think I've generally got that right, Mike?
I mean, there are sections for emergency measures to protect public safety. Mm-hmm. So, some of the cases that Shane mentioned are written into the rules as well, where someone's home is about to fall in, putting riprap on the bank to try to save that home might not be consistent with the equilibrium standard, but it's allowed under emergency protection. But otherwise, that's the standard along with the second standard of connectivity. You can't do anything that would create a disconnection hydraulically in a watershed. And for instance, a dam would create a disconnect and not be consistent with the equilibrium standard. So there's not a permitting of any new dams right now in the state. It's just maintenance of existing ones.
This would be armoring of the river, but there seems to be a trend in armoring the roadside drainage. And that was justified in saying that it will reduce erosion, it will improve water quality, but isn't it going to have problems where that water flows?
Many of our ditches are actually live streams, so there are issues with it, but generally it does change the velocity of those ditches and cause less erosion of the road. Yeah, it goes back to public safety as well.
Yeah. Is there any attempt to look for an alternative? Because that's going to be affecting where that water ends up in the river.
The rock in the channel, one of the good things about that, and I'm frustrated by this practice because I saw a lot of ditches doing this, roadside ditches doing this, and I agreed that like all of our roadside ditches doing this isn't good, right? All that sediment is going downstream. So maybe if we put rock lining in these ditches and keep them from doing that down cutting, that's good. Where they're steep and really powerful, where they're not as steep, grass, right? Grass lining them, making sure they're the right width so that they just don't have tons of power. They're wider and not so deep to begin with. The rock is angular and it's bumpy. You think of that, the hydraulic engineer term for that is roughness, that it's rough. That plays a huge role in slowing the water down. So the bumpy rock lining is good, but I think I do struggle with the practice a little bit.
Where I've seen it on Gould Hill Road and where we saw it in, I think it was Wemple.
Beverly?
She presented her, I think it was her study.
Yep.
Looking at that. These were, like I said, sliced, smooth rock. I mean, there's going to be there's microscopic roughness, maybe more than that. Between the rocks.
Yeah.
But it's a big change. I live on Gold Hill Road where erosion has always been a problem. And it certainly helps Gold Hill Road, but I'm not sure what it's doing when it hits the North Branch.
Yeah. So the rock should be 6-8 inches for, they call it 8-inch minus. So, okay. I have also seen applications where they've used the wrong material, and you're right. Like, that's not what we want to see. We want to see, they refer to as 8 inches and smaller, 8-inch minus. And that's a bumpy, rough surface that kind of governs the velocity.
I don't know that they're still using the big ones. That was several years ago.
Yeah.
It was upstream of us.
Sometimes a road commissioner or somebody else happens to have some material that's cheap and easy to get to, and that's what they use, and they don't really understand why they shouldn't. So I've got a similar issue in my town of Huntington that, yeah. So, yeah, right behind you.
You were talking before about people seeking to put in riprap to protect their homes from the damage that would be caused. But once you've put in the riprap and sped up the river, are you threatening and posing damage to your neighbors downstream?
You are, yeah.
So what's the policy on how does the person downstream say, whoa, wait a minute, you can't do that?
Yeah, so that gets to the emergency situation that Mike was talking about earlier, where there is an opportunity, and it was here on the DEC list of when we dredge. I think it's also when we armor, when there is a threat to a structure, an improved structure. I think, the state's position on this, and Mike, please jump in. I'm going to quote, I think I'm quoting you, I think I'm quoting you, like, the state is not going to condemn somebody's house by telling them they can't protect it from river erosion, right? If the river's threatening the structure, the state's not going to say, well, too bad. You're going to have to deal with the fact that your house is going to fall in the river, and that's just the way it is because we're not going to let you armor that.
But I think you're bringing up huge issue, which is we are going ahead and protecting certain structure at the expense of other structures. It's one thing to say, well, no, we shouldn't put another house there, or we shouldn't put a new structure there because we're going to have to protect it with riprap, and that's going to affect your neighbors. It's easy before the structure's there, but once the structure's there, and we're bound to protect it, it says so right in statute, we shall protect it. We know now that we're endangering other properties, and yet there's this big disconnect. So we're not condemning homes because we know that, even though in the back of our minds we know we could be endangering somebody else's home by stopping this spot is going to want to move somewhere else. And so it's a policy conundrum at this time.
The person downstream has to move somewhere else because of what the person upstream did.
I hear you. I asked the same question over and over.
And this is kind of what happens, right? We operate in a certain way as society, and we don't really understand the negative implications of the things we do, and then we figure it out, and then we come into this time period where we're like, okay, how are we going to deal with this? Because if we say no more riprapping, the people that own the house that's falling in the river upstream are impacted. And if we say yes riprapping, then the people downstream are going to be, and so, you're going to have a winners and losers. And how do we slowly get to a point where we're not in the situation? We need to get out of this situation, and I'm going to go into that in a minute. There's 1 hand, 2 hand, and Michelle's hand, and 4 hands, 5 and 6 hands. This is like this is like an auction. Michelle, go.
All right. And everybody's losing. No, I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah.
There's going to be no winners going forward with the amount of rain that we're going to have.
Yeah.
And one way out into this is to either raise insurance rates or deny insurance.
Yeah.
And force their hand.
Yes. That's something that's talked about a lot. And, Florida, California, they're like dealing with those situations.
John, one way we cannot all lose is if our communities are all working together and thinking ahead about these kinds of things. And we do have some studies happening right now in Huntington, in Marshfield, in Washington, in Plainfield, looking at the community all together. And the Winooski Flood Resilience Collaborative is looking at things on a community scale. And North Branch Nature Center has this whole series so that we can talk to each other about this. And many thanks to you all for being willing to take your time to learn about it and understand about it so that everybody can contribute to figuring out what to do.
Thank you, Michelle. This gentleman.
Hi, I'm from Plainfield, so we've got to see flooding up close and personal a couple of times.
Yep.
But, the 800-pound gorilla here is not about reaction or mitigation. It's about being proactive, stop burning fossil fuels, stop burning other stuff, because your little chart went this plus this times, look out.
Yeah, I did. That's right.
62% more moisture, 56% more moisture.
Yeah.
That's, and the insurance companies, they'll drop the small person. The floodplain keeps increasing, so everybody's flood insurance goes up. And guess who they like to fund? They're going to fund fossil fuels because people are eventually going to come after Mobil Exxon, Chevron, and the bad actors that keep pushing and pushing under the umbrella of chump in Washington.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and one that can't be understated, right? We're operating in this context of a changing climate that we really need to think about addressing that.
We, as a community, a world community, start doing a little bit of something about it and get rid of those who are the deniers.
It's a great point. Got one more here, and Michelle, come to you.
This is a rabbit hole you don't want to go down. But I I lived in Cabot, right along the river. And back in the old days, God gave something called the firm to FEMA. And that was the basis for our insurance costs, right?
Yep.
And we didn't know anything about firm, but that was all it was. So my understanding is the DEC is doing much more sophisticated mapping of floodways now to essentially replace that. What does that mapping do to help us understand floodway dynamics and act proactively? Can anybody here speak to the mapping technology?
Yeah, I think myself and Mike can both do that. I'm going to do that. I want to get your question too.
That's a rabbit hole.
No, it's not, and I'm going to get there. I'm going to, because I've been wanting to get there. That's actually where I want to go. So let me take care of other questions, and then we'll go there.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there anything to be learned from the way beavers manage water that is useful? I mean, not maybe I don't know, maybe like those really short little dams? What is the difference in behavior of the short little dams of beavers versus the great big dams?
Oh my gosh.
Why is it so much more
Sorry.
for biodiversity and stuff to have beaver dams? What is going on?
Okay, so here we are on a Nature Conservancy natural area building beaver dams because we want to stop the flow that's coming down these small incised rivers at a super high velocity going down to the Hubbardton. We want to stop those flows on this big broad field and create ponds and divert water and hold the water on the landscape. Store it on the landscape to reduce the flood peaks downstream. It's absolutely what we can learn. It's tiny. It's so small, but it's something we can do, and it's super cheap. Now, the whole question of managing beavers and beaver-human conflicts, all of that, that is a morass. That is a sticky wicket. So it's going to be a while, but the concept is correct. Hold the water on landscape. Before Europeans got to this continent, you would come across a beaver dam every 25 to 100 yards if you walked any stream. Beaver were everywhere. These valleys were full of beaver ponds. When it rained and poured and the snow melted, the beaver ponds came up. They slowly went down. Now when it rains and pours and the snow melts, the water just rushes down the channel, right? So yeah, it's the concept. It's the right concept. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the channelizing thing is a parallel to the flow of the water approach, and the beavers is.
It's great. That's great. Be perpendicular. Don't be parallel, everybody. It's right. It's right. It's absolutely.
Sorry, this is just a terminology question for the most part. But so you've talked about incision, right?
Yeah.
In the context of when humans intervene and alter the land, alter these, whether it's the floodplain, whether it's putting berms up. But just out of curiosity, is incision also something that's happening naturally, again, absent any human alteration of the floodplains? That's something that's happening naturally, just over a much longer time scale. Is that right?
You work for a conservation organization, correct? Leave it to the conservationists to point out that it's not all humans' fault. Sometimes Mother Nature. No, you're absolutely right. Channels and size. Like a big storm comes through and we get a gully washer, right? But before Europeans landed on the continent, beaver dams were every 25 to 100 yards. Log jams were massive. Those trees that have grown up for generations. We said the glacial melt retreat was 13,000 years ago. So I don't know, George, how long it took for all the soils to stabilize and trees started to grow. 3,000 years maybe? Have trees been growing in Vermont for 10,000 years? How many generations of trees have grown to full maturity, not commercial maturity, full ecological maturity, and come down on the forest floor, come down in our rivers, clogging our floodplains? So all of that stuff, the incision would happen, but a lot less frequently because there was so much structure. There were so many obstacles in the way. The water couldn't get moving with that head of steam to move those gravels and carve those channels, right? So yeah, it does all happen naturally, but we've changed things a bit in favor of power of the flow. We like the power of the flow.
So going through this presentation, it seems like a lot of this consensus that's been built around how we should manage rivers now is relatively recent history. Has Vermont been kind of like at the front line of this? Is this like homegrown kind of knowledge that is kind of coming in here, radiating out, or is there kind of more work that has been happening? A lot of places have rivers. Has this been a global phenomenon of coming into this?
Yeah, it's a good question. Context is important. The science really was done in a great majority of the science was done in the West. Some of the science was done in the East. We're talking 60s, when Leopold was 60s, 70s, 80s, slowly starting to see the picture. And then in the 90s, this cowboy from out West started offering these training programs to come out west to my ranch and learn how to restore my river. And some folks in Vermont went out there and learned how to restore rivers and got really immersed in the science. And then maybe we started to think, oh, I'm not really sure that guy's exactly right, but there's a lot that's right there. Like, he's got a lot of it right. And boy, did he teach us a lot. In the state of Vermont, the body politic is such that people in state government were able to parlay that new understanding of the science into policy. Whereas in other places across the country, it just didn't happen as quickly. And not to say that no other place, there are other jurisdictions across the country where some of these concepts are embedded in policy. But in Vermont, I think, and like the center of the universe right there is right here at the center of the room. So yeah, sorry, Mike, but you know, it's the reality. So yeah, we were just more successful at translating what we understood in terms of science into policy in Vermont. Yeah, and even to the federal government, we've actually. So now in Vermont, if you want to put in a new bridge or culvert, that culvert has to meet standards that are beyond what FEMA would require. When they come in after a flood, they require that you put the same culvert back for the most part, or that it met engineering standards that just made sure that the culvert could move the water through without overtopping the road. What the science told us was that, well, a culvert that's big enough to move the water isn't necessarily good enough. It's also got to move the sediment, because if you don't move the sediment piles up upstream of the culvert and it pushes the river back and forth, and eventually the river erodes the road bank, and you know, it does overtop because the culvert plugs, even if your engineering says that it's called clear water hydraulics. So after Irene, there was a major push on FEMA to replace culverts that met Vermont's standards. Vermont had rules that said, no, you had to do better than that. And FEMA said, no, those aren't really rules that we have to abide by. And Mike fought FEMA for multiple years. And now when FEMA pays for a culvert to be replaced after a flood, it meets the Vermont standards. So that's where we are.
So I can't resist, though, saying that all of this came about because there were other pressures happening as well. Right? The Lake Champlain phosphorus levels were going up and up, and what carries phosphorus but sediment. So we had a perfect storm, if you will, aligning a lot of different policy silos into better policy.
Absolutely. So it was the work of the entire Department of Environmental Conservation, the Agency of Natural Resources. George was doing great stuff looking at landslide mapping at the time. We were learning more about landslides and understanding the relationship between what was going on in the rivers and landslides and the hazards those created. So, you know, there's credit all around it. It's not just one program, but it was the entire state apparatus, the federal apparatus, the municipalities, the people who were open-minded to hear something new and different, right? So there were a lot of people involved.
The win-win situations that is what we presented to folks with the science. With the Lakes program, we went to Eric Smeltzer with these models. And he was the one that looked beyond just point source and land runoff equations for the TMDL and said, here's some data that matters. And that's why Vermont worked with EPA create the first TMDL in the nation that recognized stream alteration as a major influence on Lake Champlain. So yeah, it was just that synergy. It was the transportation engineers going, gee, we have been replacing our structures every 20 or 30 years because they can't pass sediment. This makes sense.
Yeah.
And they joined with the Rivers
Yeah.
program to push FEMA into adopting our standards. So yeah, it was just the power of the data and the openness of so many partners to see that as a win for their own interests. This was all in the 2000 odds, through Irene and Azra.
Since we're running out of time, I want to make sure you can cover anything else that you want to tell us before we get back into questions. We could do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so,
All right. Great. Thanks. So getting back, I'm coming back to your question. Proactively, right? Acting proactively, is that where we left off? That was, or
There's
proactive.
technology for developing the maps. So we're applying technology.
Oh, that's right, the firms.
We get pictures, but there's data behind it. So how does that data in those more sophisticated maps help us decide what to do in the case of the given property insurance problem or a channelization problem?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So there's the National Floodplain Insurance Program, and they issue these maps, and those maps tell us if our home is in a floodplain and if we need flood insurance or not. And Vermont's been participating in the National Floodplain Insurance Program for years. And we have a high level of participation across the state, really high level of participation amongst our municipalities. There are a few drawbacks of the NFIP. First of all, I'm trying to do this quick. Remember, all of our damage, 75% of our damage is erosion damage. NFIP is all about inundation damage. Those maps show you where the water's going to go, not where the erosion's going to happen.
So for instance, they don't map velocity in different conditions.
No, no, nothing about that would get at erosion, just inundation. So here we have this house here on the Mad River in Waitsfield, Warren Town Line. Well, I guess Waitsfield, sitting there. That orange polygon is the National Floodplain Insurance mapped floodplain. So if that, I'm sorry, the yellow polygon, the yellow polygon. So if that house were in this polygon, it would be in the floodplain. And that homeowner would need flood insurance. The house is not in that yellow polygon. That's the river right through the middle there. So they didn't need flood insurance, and they didn't have any flood hazards. They didn't have any flood hazards. They didn't have any inundation hazards, right? Inundation hazards. They didn't have inundation hazards. They didn't have to muck out their basement. But boy, did they have erosion hazards. This orange polygon is what the state refers to as the river corridor. The state began mapping river corridors in about 2010, and just last year, the legislature passed Act 121, which addressed river corridors, wetlands, dam safety. I'm forgetting one. There's one other. River corridors. It addressed river corridors. So the state was mapping river corridors. It was developing model bylaw language that towns could use to adopt river corridor protections. The town could take the map that the state gave it and could say, okay, we're gonna require a permit if you want to build in the river corridor. Every town could do that, and the state was pushing towns to do that. Include river corridor protections in your bylaws so that your homeowners don't end up like, your citizens don't end up like this. They recognize when they're in an erosion hazard area. After 2023, the legislature passed Act 121. Act 121 gives the authority to the Agency of Natural Resources to regulate river corridors statewide. we had maybe 20, 30 towns that had adopted as, I think it was about that, 20, 30 towns, maybe a little more or less. The legislature said, you know what, we like this river corridor idea. We recognize that our erosion hazards are our issue, and A&R, build a permitting program and start requiring permitting for permit for any development in the river corridor. We're going to stop putting people in harm's way. We're not going to do that anymore, so that we don't have to have these discussions about, well, your home is threatened and you want to riprap it, but I'm downstream. If you riprap it, you're going to threaten me. We're just going to stop we're going to stop creating that problem. This is an enormous, I keep pointing to this thing, this is a river corridor. And you have to get a permit if you want to build in there now from A&R. Well, starting in 2028, starting in January 1, 2028, we're going to stop creating that problem. So that was it's a career for me. It's a career sort of, milestone. So it's a tremendous step forward. So this was in a section of this presentation that was like, well, what can we do? You're telling us we can't dredge. What can we do? So we adopted river corridor protections. We can get away from the minimum NFIP standards. We can use standards that are better. The state is pushing what they call a no adverse impact approach to floodplain regulations, which basically means, in a nutshell, one landowner can't do something on their land in the floodplain that's going to increase the hazard for other landowners. So you can't go in and put a bunch of huge fill in the floodplain and take up that floodplain space so that you can build a house there anymore, because now that floodplain isn't there to hold water and protect your neighbors downstream. So that's the approach. So we want better standards for inundation to mitigate inundation hazards.
And the political pushback is you're regulating more land. Some people look at it and say, what? This doesn't flood. This basement never floods, but you're regulating it because you're recognizing this larger context.
Yeah, and there was political pushback. There still is political pushback, but we're moving forward. We're moving forward. So other things we can do, right? This is the tributary to the Lamoille River in Jeffersonville. Before, after, they took that narrow bridge, made a much wider bridge. This is right here. This is now floodplain. This is now that pressure relief valve. This is an area that can store water during a flood event and lower the peaks downstream. So we can make our structures bigger, right? We can rebuild floodplain that we've lost to fill. This just shows another, again, these are all from SLR. This shows a bridge in Hardwick, one of the places where a flood study was done. Michelle mentioned a number of flood studies that are going on. This just shows, this is the bridge opening. It's 43 feet wide currently. They're proposing to widen that bridge opening to 58 feet. And you can see, here's the large flood now. Here's under the proposed wider bridge, here's the large flood. It's 0.8 of a foot lower, which doesn't sound like a lot, but 0.8 of a foot is, it's a lot. And the medium flood is half a foot lower under the wider bridge. So making our structures bigger reduces the flood elevations. It reduces the energy in the flow. Here's another example. This is Jeffersonville here. This culvert overtopped, the road overtopped. Here's another culvert. They put in a bigger culvert. That's the flood of Halloween 2019. All the water's passing through, the road's high and dry. So, flood hazard mitigation, bigger structures. This is a Vermont River Conservancy project down the Whetstone Brook down in Brattleboro, where they went in. This was all a bunch of fill. It was an industrial site. This is after it had been cleared and a lot of the fill had been removed. I'll show you a better picture of this in a minute. But they open up, this is all now floodplain for this brook. So when the water comes up, it can spread out over here. Downstream Brattleboro sees lower flood surfaces during flood events. This is the schematic. This was all the fill. They took all this out, and now the land's down here. And like the 100-year floodplain used to be here, and now it's here. The 50-year flood used to be up here, now it's down there. So we can restore our floodplains, Restore that river floodplain connectivity. The river needs to be connected to the floodplain so it can utilize it during times of high flows. I could go on for way too long, so we're like, we said we weren't going to keep everybody here until 8, but boy, anybody want to stick around? Just kidding. So yeah, those are the things we can do, and we can, the beaver things, and then I have to do this last one because this is what I'm really focused on right now. This is a log jam. That's a log jam that resulted from a bunch of log jams that we built in the stream. We're adding that structure back to our rivers. This is actually 5 constructed log jams, human-built log jams that were like 5 of them upstream in series. The flood of they went in 2020. The flood of 23 went through, picked up all of our little log jams, made one big jam, filled the channel, and upstream of there for about 150 feet it filled with sediment. So this incised condition, remember the big rocks I was talking about? Lots of energy, deep channel. This is the incised river. Upstream of it, it's not incised anymore. It's filled right up. It's connected to its floodplain. And this is a super cheap way to do this, to restore these streams. So we can do stuff. We can do stuff. We shouldn't be dredging, but as much as we did in the past, but there are things that we can do. So yeah, I took up the whole time.
Feel free to,
I feel like you had a question.
And hang out and
Okay.
ask more questions and that sort of thing, but I want to officially dismiss the class. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
So